Hey guys, welcome back, and we are at the end of the month of Hades. It's been a busy month here, but finally we get to talk about one of the now classic games of Final Fantasy X, and there's a lot to talk about here, and well, enough stalling, let's just go. As of this recording, Final Fantasy X is the most recent Final Fantasy that I've personally beaten, and it was played on the HD Remaster PS4 version. I'll get into the remaster stuff at the end of the video. Of course, this wasn't my first time of beating Final Fantasy X, that was actually all those years ago whenever it first came out on the PlayStation 2, and I hadn't actually revisited the game fully since then. However, I have, and I've beaten it, and it was amazing as always. So let's go ahead and get a little bit about the release info of the game before we dive right into the meat of this JRPG defining masterpiece. So the game was released to the world in 2001, and it was a year or so after the PlayStation 2 was released. It came out on July 19th for Japan, December 17th for North America, and on May 17th and the 24th in 2017 for Australia and the EU respectively. Whenever the game hit the shelves, it was given amazing ratings and scores. At the time, it was recorded as the fastest selling console RPG, but has since then been surpassed. But it's still important to note because of how genre defining the game was. The game was developed by Final Fantasy veterans, of course. The executive producer was Sakaguchi, who hopefully you're all familiar with at this point. The producer was Yoshinori Kitase, and of course the music was created partially, which is something interesting to note, by the one and only Nobuo Uematsu, who we've talked about at length. It was also co-scored by Junya Nanako and Masashi Hamazu, who were apparently chosen to give the musical score a little bit of a different feel from the rest of the Final Fantasy series, and you're going to notice this trend throughout the entire game itself if and when you play it. That being that Final Fantasy X has a little bit more of a different feel than those that came before it. So if there's anything to take away from Final Fantasy X, it's the influence that the game had on the JRPG genre as a whole. So let's get into what makes this game particularly defining like it is. As a precursor, I want to acknowledge that I'm sure there are a lot of games that have done some of these things before, but as such, Final Fantasy is a high-profile game and really was one of the first to integrate all of these different things together and have a huge impact on the way it did. So starting off here, this was a radical departure from the previous Final Fantasies that were developed on the PlayStation 1, and in fact most RPGs from that era, as the gameplay usually took place on a pre-rendered background, only using fully 3D polygon models for battle scenes. This was no longer the case with Final Fantasy X, as the entire game was rendered using 3D polygonal models. This allowed for different camera angles unlike its predecessors. So I know it's a given now, it's the video game norm that we have polygons everywhere, but back then in the early 2000s this was actually pretty insane, especially for a Final Fantasy game which could be 50 plus hours, 100 plus if you're going to do everything. It's a massive game and it took a lot of time and effort to get those models how they were. So along with that, we have possibly even a bigger achievement with the fact that the large majority of the game was voiced over, which again is a huge challenge as this amount of dialogue hadn't really been done on this scale before. And with that being said, the game has come under quite a bit of harsh criticism from bad voiceovers, especially referring to one scene in particular, and I'm pretty sure you all know which one I'm talking about, but if not, let's just watch for a second.
Right. Now let's see what you can do.
Huh?
Come on.
This is weird.
Next, try laughing out loud.
What?
Come on, show me. You probably shouldn't laugh anymore. Too funny.
It was your idea.
For a second. So I'm actually going to stray a little bit from the norm here with me giving a sort of objective point of view. I do want to give my thoughts on this whole scene. I personally think that the voiceovers are fine for the majority of the game, but here and there they're off a little bit, I guess, off in the sense that the voices don't necessarily sound natural in particular conversations, probably much like I sound in this video, but not in this scene. It baffles me to the point of why this is the prime example of terrible voice acting. It's not. It's just simply not. And it's not just simply this scene, but the specific ha 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 part of it. I don't know if people just weren't paying attention or what, but it's, you know, a newsflash, guys, it's supposed to be bad. They spend a lot of time talking about you forcing yourself to be happy around people and how you have to train yourself to do it and do things that you probably don't really want to do, but you have to give off that appearance. And in this case, they were talking about forcing yourself to laugh. So of course it's going to be bad because they're forcing it. If anything, this is one of the best voice acting scenes in the game because it pulls off its goal superbly. And I'm sorry for going on a bit of a tangent here, but I could just simply not disagree more with those who point to this particular scene to demonstrate terrible voice acting or voiceovers in the game. But going beyond that, there's actually something else that's taken away by the introduction of voice acting, and that's the naming of your characters, which has been a series mainstay since the beginning. And they actually give you a weird compromise here because you get to name the main character, who I refer to him as Titus. I know some people call him Titus, and I hate that name. I don't really care if I'm wrong. He's going to be called Titus to me. However, that's the only character that you get to name, and the other ones are set because of voiceovers, which also makes it a little weird because you never actually hear people audibly call you by your name, being Titus or Titus or whatever. It's not super apparent, but once you get this in your mind and you go back and play the game, it's just really, I don't know, it's just strange. So going from that, getting back on track, we have one of the more shocking changes to the series, and that's that they scrapped the overworld map free-form roaming. Although, to be fair, most overworld maps do in fact restrict you to your progress following a linear story, but the illusion of freedom was there. So that's not really the case in Final Fantasy X. It's not really as big of a deal as I make it out to be, but it's a pretty big change to the franchise. Something else to note here is the character designs in the game, and this is another huge influence on the way that JRPGs were headed. The character designer here was Tetsuya Nomura, which really brought to the forefront his unique and quirky and I guess just sometimes downright crazy character designs, specifically with their wardrobes. At this point, we start to see just, I don't even know what to call it, like just insane character designs pop up in Japanese RPGs just in general as a whole. As a result, we get a pretty big divide in Westerners, as some of them are put off by the strange non-traditional designs. Of course, it's a preference on what you do and do not like, but it should be noted that this caused a major rift in the fan base of JRPGs and role-playing games in general. So some of those are the more profound aspects of the game which have made their mark on the JRPG landscape forever, but that's not really the only wildly interesting things here. Let's talk a little bit about the battle system and the way things are handled in that form. The battle system is actually completely unexpected because of how it pushes the envelope in terms of how the battles are handled, while kind of looking back, and I mean way back, to the original Final Fantasy battle system being very much turn-based, with no hint of an ATB time bar here. Some of the more interesting things that they've done here is revert back from the 3 character parties down from 4 in Final Fantasy IX. However, it's not really much of a restriction, as you can freely swap out your party members as you like during the battle itself, which was just mind-blowing, really. So you have complete control over how you want to handle the enemies that you're facing, because every character kind of has their own little shtick. For example, some characters may be good at dealing with flying creatures, while others may be good at getting through high defense creatures. Had there been no character switching, this would have been a pain. Something else interesting to note here is that, at least for the original versions of the leveling up system known as the sphere system or sphere grid, which I'll get into in a second, each character is really defined by a job, despite there being no true jobs in the game, I guess if you want to call it like that. And speaking of leveling up, this game actually ditches levels completely, which at the time would be blasphemy, basically. However, the level system in here was replaced with this incredibly expansive sphere grid system, where you move along a path and you get new spells and abilities, HP, strength, accuracy, all that kind of stuff. So the sphere system really allows for a consistent slow growth rather than a sort of step function where you level up and you just instantly get more powerful, because why not, right? I actually really enjoyed this way of leveling. I don't know that I would like all of my games to do it, but it really does define Final Fantasy X in the way that it has. And of course, we can't talk about the battles without talking about the summons. And if you watched my Final Fantasy VIII video, I said that that game was the summon game, and I actually still do stick by that statement, but Final Fantasy X does give it a run for its money, if simply not for how the summons just fit into the overall narrative. So let me be clear here that this is a summon-focused game through and through, and could easily be sitting on top of the pedestal with Final Fantasy VIII as being the summon game. But anyway, with that being said, here we have a new way of using summons in battle that had not been done before, and that's the fact that whenever you summon a creature, you actually get to play as the creature in the battle. So each summon has its own ability set, its strengths and weaknesses, and all of that. Each summon levels up as well, essentially making them members of your party as much as any of the other main characters. Sure, you don't always get to play as them, but you do often enough to warrant a leveling progression system for them. So it should be noted here that though the system isn't drastically different from the originals, the fact that they have moved away from an ATB system gives us hints that they aren't afraid to change things up, and we will see that is definitely the case in the subsequent games in the franchise. So let's talk about the characters for a bit, and then of course I'll give a brief introduction to the story itself. In Final Fantasy tradition, our characters here have incredibly in-depth personalities, and each one of them is different, but all of them have to get through incredibly deep story arcs that get explored in a variety of ways. It's nothing absolutely earth-shattering as far as character development goes, but it's solid and handled fantastically, especially with the twists and turns that we get. Our main character here is Titus, or again Titus, but I call him Titus, and what's interesting here is that Titus isn't really the main character of the overall story, but as we bear witness in the beginning, he is, as we all are, the main character of his story, of his life, as we all are of our own. But what they've done here with Titus is pretty brilliant. He actually acts as the link between the character and the player in discovering what the world is all about. So his confusion to the cultures and other things presented kind of mirrors our own curiosity about these things as well, and it just allows them to explain it in such a way that doesn't really break the fourth wall. Of course, there are some major twists and turns, but we can't really talk about him here. Titus is a fine main character, and though the twists and turns involving him are crazy, Titus, I'd say, doesn't really have the most noticeable growth as a character. He's generally a happy, cheerful guy and stays that way through most of the game despite the crap that he does have to go through, and he does have a pretty rough backstory. So the next character, who I would call the true main character of the game, is Yuna, and Yuna's a fledgling summoner who's destined to save the world from the evil monster known as Sin. There's a lot to talk about with Yuna, but I have to stick to my morals and philosophy of not ruining the story, so I really can't talk much more about her in lieu of that. Yuna's an incredibly self-sacrificing character, only wanting to make sure that others are happy, even if she herself isn't. Third character we're going to talk about is Waka, who's one of the first permanent characters to join the party, and Waka is a blitzball player. Now, what is blitzball? Well, blitzball is a sort of water polo soccer type of game that's incredibly popular. Waka, like many of the other characters, does have a dark past, but he keeps up with a positive attitude with his belief in a greater power, and that's a huge point in the game. Waka definitely has a character arc dealing with some of these profound realizations in a similar way that I would say that Steiner deals with his realizations in Final Fantasy IX. Next up, we have Lulu, who is very much connected to Waka personally for a variety of reasons that I can't go into here. Lulu is more of a cynical, no, you know what, I'm not gonna use that word. That's not really the right word. Let's say Lulu's a strict character, but with her way and how she connects to Waka and Yuna, she's definitely kind of like a mothering character, I guess, making sure that everyone stays on the straight and narrow. In this terms, Lulu is definitely the black mage of the game. She does have magical abilities, and yeah. Kamari is up next. He's one of our few different races of the world. Basically, he's an anthropomorphized lion or tiger with blue skin and a horn. More specifically, it's a broken horn. He's the least connected to Yuna as far as his past is concerned, but he's also one of the most loyal to her and her quest. There's a really neat thing about his race and Yuna that gives a nod to Final Fantasy lore, so if you do play the game, keep an eye out for a statue, and then go look at some of the more distinctive features of summoners, and it's a really cool wink to the nod of the lore of summoners in Final Fantasy as a whole. Other than that, Kamari wields a spear and is a sort of blue mage dragoon character boasting classic abilities from both jobs in the past games. Next up is Aron, who is one of the first proper characters we meet that has a direct connection with Titus and with Yuna in a kind of a sort of strange way. Aron is many people's favorite character, and it doesn't really take much to see why. He's some incredibly crazy twists with his backstory and everything, and is fairly well reserved, giving advice when needed. Aron is definitely the fighter, but more specifically, he's modeled in a sort of samurai aesthetic. Alright, next up is Riku, and she's our thief of the game, and in Final Fantasy VI fashion, she'd probably rather more likely to be called a treasure hunter than a thief. Riku has ties with Yuna on a very personal level, and her father is none other than the one and only Cid. Riku is incredibly, I I guess the best word would be spunky, I guess. And of all the parts, she is definitely the most chipper and upbeat of our entire character roster. And of course, as always, to cap these character offs, I'll talk a little bit about the villains as much as I possibly can. The first and primary villain is introduced immediately to the story as it begins, and this is Sin. Sin is a sort of evil ocean fish whale looking thing with immense destructive power and is the center point of the game. Though being a monster, Sin doesn't really have a lot of personality to go off of, which makes him a threatening creature, but really that's about it. Or at least that's all I can talk about. And the more traditional villain, what you think of as a Final Fantasy villain, there are minor spoilers ahead, so if you don't care, then keep watching. If you do, then turn it off or skip ahead. But the more classic villain type character here is Seymour, which we meet a few hours in the game. He isn't just incredibly apparent, but Seymour is part of another race known as the Guado, and he has a classic Final Fantasy villain look. You know the look, wherever you see him and you're like, bam, yep, he's the villain. I can't really say much more about him other than that, like he's a Guado, like I said. And honestly, to me, he's personally not the best villain in my eyes. He's I don't really know. There's just something I don't necessarily like about him as the villain. But again, he's not the main primary antagonist here. We have the much more major threat of Sin always in the background. So with those of our cast of characters, it does no good to leave them in a vacuum. And so let's talk about the story and how and where the story takes place. Now, as always, I'm not going to go in depth with it, but to be warned, I'm probably going to talk about the first 30 or so minutes of the game because I do want to give you an idea of what you're getting into, and it's very hard to just do it right at the beginning because it's so different from any of the other Final Fantasies. So if you don't want spoilers, turn back now. At least small spoilers. So first off, the world that we explore throughout the main story is known as Spira, and one of the major cities in this world of Spira is Zanarkand, Tidus's hometown. And through a series of events at the beginning of the game, Tidus has a run-in with Sin and gets teleported to a random destination on Spira. Pretty standard stuff, you just want to get back home. Problem is that as you go and you meet some of the people and start talking to them, you find out that Zanarkand was destroyed, which you would think, all right, it's pretty common. Sin appeared, he destroyed Zanarkand, you want to get home, whatever, but that's really actually not the point. Zanarkand was destroyed about 1,000 or so years ago. So yeah, I'm not going to go any further with the story, but hopefully that may, get you wanting to play the game a little bit. The actual world of Spira here is incredibly relaxing, of all things, despite the threat of Sin always being in the background. The developers look towards a southern South Pacific kind of islander theme, which I personally love. The game is incredibly bright, vibrant. It has a lot of ocean and coral tones and colors, giving it a really unique feel. I'd say that it would be most comparable to like the palette from Chrono Cross in the way that the ambient is set up, the colors kind of interact. And Chrono Cross is one of, if not my favorite RPG ever. That being said, sadly during this time, this is whenever we started to make a push for what is often known as the gritty, tending towards brown and bloom in video games. So this was one of the kind of last hurrahs for color, I guess, as it were. So to wrap this up, the story is absolutely wonderful, and they do play up the fact of romance pretty heavily here. In fact, it's one of the game's defining features, but I've said in previous major installment videos that the game series does tend to begin to heavily steer towards this romance feature in Final Fantasy, and honestly, the game does it pretty damn well. There's one scene that everyone points to that is pretty much genre defining. Again, I've used that so many times now, but it's one of the most memorable moments in the game, and I would absolutely agree that it's one of the best moments in the game. So one last thing before we wrap this video up is that we need to talk about the HD remaster or re-releases or whatever you want to call them. In these releases, they came out on the PS3, the Vita, the PlayStation 4, and most currently the PC. They look incredibly good with actually some brand new models, but some people complain about these new character models in that they warp the faces a bit too much, and honestly, I'll be frank, I've never noticed this, but it seems that it bugged a lot of people in a lot of ways. And if you see a side-by-side comparison, yeah, it does, but honestly, who is playing the game side-by-side? Like, you don't even think about it, really. But it did bug a lot of people, so we do need to mention it. The game actually came with Final Fantasy X-2 Remaster, as well as Final Fantasy X's International Grid System, often referred to as the Expert Grid System. Now, currently, my recent playthrough of the game was with this new grid system, and for just a quick recap of how it's different, the sphere board is laid out out, just basically completely different, and everyone kind of starts out in the same place. But it does have a lot of different branching paths and opportunities, which allow you to create character strengths and weaknesses that you wouldn't really see in the game until very, very, very much later, whenever you can pretty much do anything you want with the sphere grid. Here, it gives you that freedom right off the bat. And I never found this new system to be especially hard, and in some ways, actually, I found the game much easier using this system, but I have heard that you can really screw up your characters, resulting in a much more challenging game, so just be aware of that. The remaster also gives us remastered music, which is awesome, and what's even cooler though is that you can switch between the original score and this new remastered one whenever you want, so that's just a great thing in general. You know, who could complain about that? So there it is, guys, Final Fantasy X, a game that shaped much of the franchise going forward, and just JRPGs in general, for better or worse. Let me know how you feel about Final Fantasy X in the comments, and what's your favorite thing about the game. So here we're going to say goodbye to Hades as we usher in November, the month of Carbuncle, and we'll be doing another set of variety videos ending with the first MMO in the series. It's weird to say that, but Final Fantasy XI, a game incredibly dear to myself. So thank you so much for watching, guys. Please spread this video around and maybe even sub if you like what I'm doing. But as is tradition here, let's watch this amazing opening movie, as it's one of the best in the franchise. Enjoy.